History remembers the Liberator, but behind him was a woman who saved his life and changed a continent. Tonight, you'll meet the fearless Manuela Sáenz and discover why her love story with Simón Bolívar was as dangerous as the battles they fought. This isn't just a tale of romance, it's espionage, assassination attempts, exile, and a love that defied empires. The kind of story that makes you question, how far would you go for the one you love, and for a cause that could cost you everything? Before we step into the candlelit halls of Quito and the gunpowder smoke of South America's battlefields, tap the like button so more people can uncover these forgotten chapters of history. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss the next story. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I always check. Quito, 1822. The city was alive with rumors. Only weeks earlier, Bolívar had led the decisive victory at the Battle of Pichincha, securing independence for the lands that would become Ecuador. His triumph had made him more than a general. He was now the embodiment of liberty, a living legend. The streets bustled with soldiers, merchants, and townsfolk eager to glimpse the man who had wrested their city from Spanish control. Manuela Sáenz was not among those waiting in the plaza. She was upstairs in the grand colonial home she shared with her English husband, Dr. James Thorne, looking out from a balcony at the commotion below. At 26, she was striking tall, with a confident bearing, her hair swept back in a manner more practical than fashionable. She was a woman accustomed to attention, but that day, she observed as if from a great remove, her mind turning over the reports she had heard about Bolívar. They met later that evening at a celebratory ball hosted by the local elite. Bolívar, resplendent in his military uniform, moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime in drawing rooms as well as battlefields. When introduced to Manuela, he bowed slightly, not the deep, formal bow of European courts, but the warm acknowledgement of an equal. Their conversation began with pleasantries about the evening, but quickly turned to politics and the state of the revolution. Manuela spoke with a directness unusual for a woman in such company. She questioned his plans for the newly liberated territories, challenged him on his strategy for uniting lands so diverse in geography and culture. Bolívar, accustomed to deference, found himself intrigued by her candor. The night ended with a dance. Bolívar was not known for his dancing, but with Manuela, he moved as though the steps came naturally. There was already an unspoken understanding between them that they belonged to the same current of history, that their meeting was not chance but inevitability. Manuela's life had never fit neatly into the mold expected of women of her class. Born in Quito to a Spanish father and a mother of mixed heritage, she had been educated in a convent but expelled at 17 for scandalous behavior, sneaking out to meet a lover. She married James Thorne at 21, but the marriage was one of convenience and social positioning, not love. When Bolívar came into her life, she was already politically engaged, having smuggled information and supplies to revolutionaries. In the months after their first meeting, Bolívar wrote to her from the field. His letters mixed military reports with personal observations, often veiled but unmistakable in their affection. Manuela replied with equal fervor, offering not just encouragement but counsel. She was unafraid to critique his decisions, and he, unusually, valued her input. By late 1822, she had joined him in Lima, where their relationship became more public and more controversial. The polite society of the day viewed her with suspicion. She was a married woman traveling without her husband, politically outspoken and fiercely loyal to Bolívar in both personal and military matters. Rumors swirled, but Manuela seemed immune to them. War left little room for intimacy. They met in cities between campaigns, sometimes for only days at a time. Yet those days were filled with small rituals, Bolívar reading poetry aloud in the evenings, Manuela tending to his injuries, their conversations ranging from the strategy of battles to the philosophy of governance. In one surviving letter, Bolivar wrote, "You have taken my heart by storm, as we have taken the fortresses of the enemy, with daring, with brilliance, with the certainty that resistance is futile." Manuela, for her part, began signing her letters, "Your Libertadora," a title she wore proudly. But even in the glow of these reunions, shadows gathered. Bolivar's political position was precarious. Factions within the independence movement were already fracturing. His personal enemies viewed Manuela as a liability, a woman whose influence could sway him toward reckless decisions. Her very presence at his side on military campaigns, dressed in uniform, riding astride a horse, was seen as scandalous. And yet, neither withdrew. Each understood the cost of the alliance, and each chose to bear it. By 1825, the revolution had swept through most of northern South America, but the unity Bolivar dreamed of, a single republic stretching from the Caribbean to the Andes, was proving fragile. His days were consumed by governance, his nights by correspondence and strategy. Still, he found ways to see Manuela, summoning her under the pretense of official duties or arranging to pass through towns where she was staying. The world around them was turbulent, unpredictable, and often hostile. Yet in those brief hours together, a supper in a candlelit room, a walk along a quiet courtyard, a letter smuggled through dangerous territory, they carved out a space where the noise of revolution receded. Would their love survive the relentless demands of war and politics? Or would it be swallowed, as so many personal bonds were, by the tides of history they themselves had helped set in motion? By 1828, the dream of a united Gran Colombia, stretching across modern-day Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama, was cracking. The revolution had won independence from Spain, but the unity forged in war was dissolving into political rivalries, regional ambitions, and personal vendettas. Bolivar, now president and dictator by decree, was struggling to hold the fragile republic together. In Bogotá, where Bolivar had made his seat of power, tension clung to the air like summer humidity. Newspapers railed against him. Political enemies whispered in parlors and plotted in back rooms. To many, Bolivar was no longer the liberator but an obstacle, a man who clung to power in the name of preserving the nation he had built. Manuela Sáenz was there with him. Her presence was not ceremonial. She attended councils, managed correspondence, and acted as a trusted political advisor. In the streets, people called her La Libertadora del Libertador, the liberator of the liberator, a title that would soon gain a more literal meaning. It was September 25, 1828, when the rumors became reality. Bolivar had been warned of an assassination plot, but the warnings were vague, the kind of political noise he had grown accustomed to ignoring. Manuela, however, sensed the danger. She had long been attuned to the undercurrents of political intrigue, and something about the mood in the city unsettled her. That evening, Bolivar attended a late meeting in the presidential palace. Returning to his quarters just after midnight, Manuela was waiting, seated at a desk strewn with papers. She urged him to rest, but he insisted on writing several urgent letters. As the hours passed, the streets outside fell silent. Then, faint at first but growing louder, came the sound of boots on cobblestones. Within minutes, shouts echoed from the courtyard, the voices of armed men demanding entry. Manuela moved quickly. She barred the doors, then turned to Bolivar. "You must go," she said. "I will not flee from my own house," Bolivar replied, his voice low but firm. "If you stay, you will die," she answered. "And if you die, everything you fought for will die with you." The attackers were already at the gates. Manuela shoved Bolivar toward a window that opened onto the gardens. "Jump," she ordered. He hesitated only long enough to grab his sword before dropping into the darkness below. She closed the window behind him, then turned to face the inevitable. The assassins, members of a faction opposed to Bolivar's rule, burst into the room moments later. Manuela stood her ground. She told them Bolivar was inside, deliberately drawing them into the palace to give him time to escape. Some accounts say she even fought them off with a sword. Others that she stalled them with furious words. Either way, her defiance bought Bolivar the precious minutes he needed. Bolivar fled barefoot through the streets of Bogotá, making his way to a loyalist safe house. When dawn broke, he was alive, shaken but alive, because Manuela had refused to abandon him. From that day forward, she was not just his companion, not just his political confidant, she was his savior. The assassination attempt only deepened the political fractures in Gran Colombia. Bolivar's enemies saw it as evidence of instability. His allies took it as proof that the revolution's ideals were under siege. For Manuela, it cemented her role as a lightning rod. She was celebrated by Bolivar's supporters, but despised by his opponents, who saw her as a meddling woman wielding undue influence. Pamphlets circulated in Bogotá mocking her as the general in skirts. Social invitations disappeared. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her, but she was undeterred. In public, she walked with her head high. In private, she pressed Bolivar to take stronger action against the rebels. Still, even the strongest partnership cannot escape the weight of history. The pressures on Bolivar mounted. Provinces threatened secession. Generals turned against him, and his health began to falter. Manuela tried to shield him from some of the political venom, but there was only so much she could do. Their relationship during these years was marked by both intensity and exhaustion. They still shared moments of tenderness, Bolivar dictating letters to her while she corrected his phrasing. Evenings spent recalling their first meeting in Quito, but there was an undercurrent of inevitability. They both knew that the cause they had fought for was slipping away. In 1830, the collapse came. Venezuela seceded, followed by Ecuador. Bolivar resigned the presidency, intending to go into exile in Europe. Manuela wanted to accompany him, but political pressure made it impossible. His enemies demanded her removal from Bogotá, and he could not protect her without further inflaming the situation. Their final parting was quiet. No dramatic declarations, no promises they knew they could not keep. Just a lingering clasp of hands, the weight of unspoken words passing between them. Manuela was exiled to Jamaica, and later to the dusty port town of Payta, Peru. Bolivar, weakened by illness, died later that same year at the age of 47. News of his death reached her slowly, carried by merchant ships and whispered by travelers. When she heard, she locked herself in her small house for 3 days, refusing food or visitors. From then on, she lived in relative obscurity. She kept Bolivar's letters and her own political papers hidden, fearing they might be seized or destroyed. She never remarried, never sought another public role. To the world, she was a relic of a revolution whose time had passed. But to those who knew her, she remained fiercely proud of the part she had played, both in history and in the life of the man she had loved. Could the legacy of their love survive in a world eager to forget the women of history? Or would Manuela Sáenz, the woman who once stood between Bolivar and a circle of assassins, fade into the margins, her name surviving only as a footnote in the Liberator's life? Payta, Peru, 1830. The sea here was different from the Caribbean, colder, rougher, more indifferent. The port town of Payta was a scattering of low, whitewashed houses battered by salt wind, its streets lined with fishermen's nets and stray dogs. To the casual traveler, it was a place to pass through, not to stay. Yet this was where Manuela Sáenz had been exiled, sent far from the political centers of South America after Bolivar's death. She was 40 years old, a widow in all but name, and the woman who had once danced in the grand salons of Quito and ridden alongside the liberator of half a continent now found herself living in a modest wooden house, its shutters always trembling in the coastal gusts. Her possessions were few: a small table, a rocking chair, a trunk of clothes, and, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, a packet of letters from Bolivar. She kept them in a carved wooden box under her bed, taking them out on evenings when the wind howled too loudly through the eaves. Some were formal, addressed in the manner of political correspondence. Others were intimate, written in the quick, looping hand he used when pressed for time, full of affectionate teasing and private jokes. She read them slowly, mouthing the words as if to summon his voice. In exile, she became something of a curiosity to the sailors, merchants, and occasional foreign travelers who passed through Peta. Word spread that a woman who had fought in the South American Wars of Independence lived in the town, that she had been Bolivar's closest confidant. Some came out of admiration, others from a desire to see for themselves whether the rumors of her beauty and bravery were true. Manuela tolerated these visits, though she never performed her story for anyone. She told the truth when she chose to, left gaps when she preferred silence. What she would not allow was the diminishing of Bolivar's legacy. If anyone spoke ill of him in her presence, she would cut them off sharply, her voice carrying the same authority that had once silenced political rivals in Bogota. She tipped to writing her own account of events, part memoir, part defense of Bolivar's vision for a united South America. Pages of it survive today, smuggled out in the letters of friends and preserved in private collections. In them, she is unsparing in her criticism of those who betrayed the cause, and equally firm in her belief that Bolivar's dream had been worth the sacrifices. There were moments, especially in the still hours before dawn, when her mind wandered to what might have been. Had Bolivar lived, would they have found some corner of the world where the demands of politics could not reach them? Could they have grown old together, no longer as general and lover, but simply as two people sharing a life? She never let herself dwell long on these thoughts. Instead, she poured her energy into correspondence with other veterans of the Independence Wars, offering advice, sharing news, and preserving the memory of campaigns fought decades earlier. When one former officer sent her a medal that had been awarded to Bolivar, Essie placed it in the box with the letters, not as a relic, but as part of a story she considered unfinished. Years blurred into each other. Peta changed little, but the world beyond its shores moved on. New governments rose and fell. New conflicts flared. The generation that had fought for independence began to vanish, one by one, into the quiet of old age or the anonymity of forgotten graves. Manuela aged too, though her eyes kept their sharpness. Her hair, once a dark cascade, turned silver, but she carried herself with the same upright posture. Children in the town learned to give her a respectful nod when they passed her door. The adults told and retold the story of the night she had saved Bolivar from assassins, each version a little more dramatic than the last. In 1847, cholera swept through Peta. Manuela nursed neighbors and sailors alike, but when the fever came for her, there was no one left strong enough to save her. She died on November 23, 1856, at the age of 59, and was buried in an unmarked grave in the local cemetery. Her belongings, including Bolivar's letters, were reportedly burned by officials fearing contagion. It seemed for a time that her story had ended there, unmarked, unremembered, her name drifting toward the margins of history. But history, like the sea, has a way of returning what it once claimed. In the late 20th century, historians and feminists began to re-examine the role of women in the independence movements of Latin America. Manuela Sáenz emerged from the shadows, no longer merely Bolivar's mistress, but a political actor in her own right, a woman who had ridden into battle, managed intelligence networks, and shaped the course of the revolution. In 2007, the Ecuadorian government granted her the rank of general, and in 2010, her symbolic remains were placed in the National Pantheon in Caracas, alongside Bolivar's. 2 centuries after their first meeting in Quito, they were reunited, not in life, but in the collective memory of the nations they had helped to forge. Manuela Sáenz's love for Bolivar was inseparable from her love for the cause they shared. It was a partnership forged in the crucible of war, sustained by mutual respect, and tested by the relentless demands of politics. In the end, they could not escape the forces that pulled them apart, but neither could those forces erase the mark they left on each other. Her story asks us to reconsider what it means to be a partner in great historical change. It is not always about sharing a home or a quiet life. Sometimes it is about sharing the risks, the exile, the isolation, and still holding to the belief that it was all worth it. When we think of Bolivar, it is tempting to imagine him alone on the balcony of history, surveying the lands he freed. But somewhere in the frame of that picture stands Manuela, watching, advising, guarding the door against the assassins in the night. Even now, the sea off Payda carries her memory. And if you listen closely beneath the crash of the waves, you might almost hear the rustle of paper, the scratch of a pen, and the voice of a woman refusing, even in exile, to let the world forget the man she loved and the cause they fought for together. Paris, 1822. The air in Eugene Delacroix's studio smelled of turpentine, linseed oil, and damp canvas, the unmistakable perfume of an artist's life. At 24, Delacroix was already a name whispered with excitement in Persian art circles, a young painter with an unorthodox vision that promised to shake the foundations of the French Academy. His canvases were riots of color, movement, and raw emotion, the antithesis of the clean, frozen perfection of neoclassicism. But genius rarely thrives in order. The studio was a chaos of brushes, rags, pigment jars, and half-finished canvases stacked against the walls. And it was into this world of disarray that a young Breton woman named Jenny Ligjuel stepped quietly one rainy afternoon, sent by a mutual acquaintance who claimed the painter needed someone to keep him from drowning in his own mess. Jenny was in her late 20s, plain by Parisian standards, but with a kind of calm, clear gaze that suggested she saw more than she let on. She was practical, unpretentious, and had a way of moving through a space as if she belonged there without demanding to be noticed. Delacroix, amused at first by the idea of a housekeeper in his bohemian chaos, agreed to let her try. Within a week, she had transformed the studio, not into something neat, but into something navigable. Brushes were cleaned, palettes scraped, canvases arranged so they could dry without warping. Delacroix, accustomed to losing days, searching for misplaced sketches, began to find that things were exactly where he needed them. He also found himself talking to her, at first about errands, then about his work, and eventually about his doubts. Jenny listened, offering little advice, but always the right question. It was the beginning of a companionship that would last the rest of his life. Delacroix was not a man easily moved by ordinary company. His mind burned with ideas, his passions were quick, and his patience for frivolity was thin. Yet Jenny's presence was different. She did not flatter him, nor did she seek entry into the glittering salons where his name was beginning to carry weight. Instead, she brought a steadiness into his days, a sense of grounding in a life otherwise dictated by bursts of inspiration and long, fevered nights at the easel. She also began to take an interest in his work, not in the way critics or patrons did, but with the intimacy of someone who saw the paintings in every stage, the first charcoal lines, the hesitant underpainting, the sudden shift when a composition caught fire in his mind. She was there when the bark of Dante stunned the salon in 1822, when the massacre at Chaos scandalized the critics, and when liberty leading the people captured the spirit of the July Revolution of 1830. It was Jenny who prepared his studio for the endless stream of visitors, fellow artists, political figures, and occasionally women whose company was more temporary. She asked no questions about them, and he offered no explanations. There was, between them, an understanding that defied the labels of the time. She was not his mistress, nor merely his servant. She was something else, a presence both domestic and deeply personal. Paris in the 1820s and 1830s was a city in flux, politically volatile, artistically explosive, and socially restless. Delacroix thrived in the turbulence, drawing inspiration from revolutions at home and uprisings abroad. He traveled to England, to North Africa, to the Mediterranean, filling sketchbooks with scenes that would later explode into color on his canvases. Jenny did not travel with him, but she kept his home in readiness, his correspondence in order, and his personal accounts from collapsing into ruin. When he returned from a journey, she had fresh flowers on the table, his favorite coffee in the pot, and the latest Parisian gossip ready to share in her unhurried way. It was during these homecomings that their connection deepened. Delacroix, often exhausted and restless after travel, found in Jenny the one person who did not demand a performance from him. She asked about the places he had seen, not the people he had met, about the light in Tangier, not the politics of Algiers. And when he complained, as he often did, about the critics, the patrons, and the endless demands of public life, she would listen without judgment, occasionally interrupting to refill his cup. By the mid-1830s, Delacroix's health had begun to trouble him. His hands sometimes trembled after long days of painting. He developed a persistent cough that worsened in the Paris winters. Jenny became not just his housekeeper, but his nurse, preparing meals, insisting he rest, and shielding him from visitors when his strength waned. Friends noticed. Some teased him about his Breton guardian. Others whispered about the nature of their relationship. Delacroix brushed off such talk with the same ease he dismissed most social gossip. But in his journals, he wrote of Jenny with an affection and respect rarely afforded to anyone outside his closest circle. Their bond was not one of dramatic declarations or public scandal. It was built instead on 1,000 small gestures, the warmth of a fire she lit before he returned from the cold, the care with which she handled his sketches, the silence she offered when his mood was too dark for conversation. By the time the July monarchy settled over France, Jenny was an uncheckable part of Delacroix's life. She knew the rhythms of his work, the ebb and flow of his health, the particular hours of the day when he was most likely to need her. And though neither of them spoke openly of love, there was a sense in the way they moved around each other, in the ease of their shared silences, that something deeper was quietly taking root. But what, in the end, was the nature of their bond? Was it love unspoken, or simply the rare friendship that life sometimes grants to unlikely souls? And how would it hold when the storms of art, politics, and illness began to close in on them both? By the early 1840s, Eugene Delacroix was no longer the promising young provocateur of the Paris Salon. He was one of its most formidable presences. His reputation as the leading figure of French Romanticism had been cemented by paintings that roared with color and drama, The Death of Sardanapalus, Liberty Leading the People, and a host of commissions that filled the walls of public buildings and private collections alike. But with recognition came strain. He was constantly pulled between the demands of monumental public works and the quieter, more experimental pieces he painted for himself. Each large-scale project required months of standing for hours on ladders, stretching across high panels, inhaling paint fumes and dust. His cough grew worse, and bouts of fatigue began to last longer. Through all of it, Jenny Lechiwa was there, moving between the role of housekeeper, nurse, secretary, and, in moments that passed unspoken, confidant. Her Breton practicality meant she wasted no time on melodrama. She simply adjusted her care as his needs changed, arranging his brushes so they could be reached without strain, ensuring a fire was lit early to keep the chill from seeping into his bones, insisting he eat before working through the night. In the fashionable world of Paris, where artists courted scandal as eagerly as commissions, their relationship remained an enigma. Visitors to the studio often found Jenny there, but she never hovered. She might be arranging fresh flowers in a chipped vase or quietly tidying brushes while Delacroix discussed a commission with a patron. To most outsiders, she was simply part of the furniture of his life, as essential as the easel or the canvases stacked in the corner. Those who knew Delacroix well, however, understood that Jenny was something more. She had become the keeper of his moods, the stabilizing force in a life of shifting artistic and political tides. She could tell by the way he stood before a painting whether he was pleased or quietly disgusted with his work. She knew when to press him to rest and when to leave him alone with his fevered inspiration. And though they never called each other lovers, there was an intimacy between them that neither time nor gossip could touch. They dined together most evenings, simple meals, often in silence. When he read aloud from Shakespeare or Byron, she listened without fidgeting, occasionally smiling at a line that caught her fancy. And when his coughing fits forced him to pause, she would quietly pour warm tea without comment, allowing him to continue as if nothing had interrupted. By the mid-1840s, Delacroix's circle of acquaintances had expanded to include politicians, musicians, and literary giants like Chopin and George Sand. These friends often found themselves drawn to the warmth of his studio gatherings, where conversation moved fluidly from politics to art to music. Jenny was always present, though she rarely entered the debates. Instead, she moved through the room with the ease of someone who belonged, offering wine, replenishing plates, and, when necessary, signaling to Delacroix that it was time to rest. There were whispers, of course. Some suspected she was the great love of his life. Others dismissed her as merely a long-standing servant. Delacroix, ever private, offered no explanations. In his journals, he wrote of her rarely, but when he did, it was with a kind of reverence, noting her steadiness, her good heart, her loyalty. Yet Paris was not always kind to such quiet attachments. Women in Jenny's position were often invisible to history, neither wife nor mistress, without the social standing to be recognized, yet holding the emotional weight of both roles. She seemed to accept this without resentment, content to serve as the axis around which Delacroix's private life turned. As the 1850s dawned, Delacroix's health entered a steeper decline. Chronic laryngitis strained his voice. The once occasional fevers became more frequent. Large commissions for the Louvre and the Luxembourg Palace pushed his body to its limits. Jenny adapted the studio to accommodate his frailty, setting up a comfortable chair where he could work on smaller canvases, ensuring his paints and sketches were within reach without prolonged standing. She also began managing more of his correspondence, reading aloud letters from patrons and friends, and writing replies at his dictation. Delacroix, who had once bristled at the thought of relying on anyone, came to depend on her efficiency and discretion. When he traveled to the countryside to recover, it was Jenny who oversaw the studio in his absence, making certain nothing was disturbed. And yet, their conversations remained largely practical. They did not speak of us, did not give name to what they had become to each other. But the language of their days, the passing of tea, the adjusting of a shawl over his shoulders, the glance exchanged across a cluttered table, spoke of a devotion deeper than words. There is a tantalizing rumor among art historians that Delacroix once began a portrait of Jenny. Some say it was a small oil sketch, showing her seated in profile, her hair loosely bound, her hands folded in her lap. Others claim it was never more than a few charcoal lines on a scrap of paper. Whatever the truth, no confirmed image of her survives. If such a portrait existed, it may have been destroyed, or perhaps tucked away among his private papers, never intended for public eyes. But perhaps this absence is fitting. Jenny belonged to the private world of the man, not the public legend of the painter. In 1857, Delacroix's health took another blow. A severe winter aggravated his chronic ailments, leaving him bedridden for weeks. Jenny nursed him through it, her patience unwavering. Friends remarked that her devotion was like that of a wife, though she wore no ring, claimed no title, and expected no inheritance. By the spring, Delacroix had recovered enough to resume work, but the episode had changed something. He spoke more often of mortality, of the unfinished works he feared he would leave behind. Jenny listened, offering no false reassurances. Instead, she reminded him, gently but firmly, of what he had already given the world. And in quieter moments, when the light through the studio windows turned golden, he would simply look at her as if acknowledging that she, too, was among his life's finest works, not a painting, but a presence, a constant, a quiet triumph over the chaos that had defined so much of his life. Yet the question lingered, unasked but ever present. When the time came, would their story be remembered at all? Or would Jenny, like so many women who shaped the lives of great men, vanish from the record, her role preserved only in the lines of a journal, the whispers of those who had seen them together, and the silence of a love that had no need for declaration? Paris, 1859. The winter came early that year, thick with fog and the smell of burning coal from the chimneys of the Latin Quarter. In Delacroix's studio on the Rue de Furstenberg, the once boundless energy of the painter's youth had slowed to a measured rhythm, still fierce in moments, but interrupted by long pauses, the fatigue settling in like a second presence in the room. Jenny Leguilou moved quietly through the space, as she had for nearly 4 decades. She had grown older too, her once dark hair now streaked with white, her hands roughened by years of work. But her gait retained its steadiness, and her eyes, those calm Breton eyes, still met his with the same level, unflinching gaze as when they first met. The studio, for all its clutter, had become a kind of sanctuary. The high windows caught the winter light and softened it, filtering it through pale curtains so the canvases glowed without glare. Paintings in progress leaned against the walls, studies for floral still lifes, small mythological scenes, portraits of imagined figures. Delacroix no longer undertook the grand, sprawling murals of his earlier years. His health would not allow it, but his brush still carried the same intensity, and always Jenny was there. By now, their lives were so intertwined that the thought of one without the other seemed impossible. They still never spoke of their relationship in romantic terms. It was not the language they used. Yet every action was steeped in a deep, mutual recognition of what they were to each other. Delacroix's friends understood it, even if society never named it. Charles Baudelaire, who admired Delacroix immensely, once remarked that the painter's home was as well kept as a monastery and with a similar air of devotion. That devotion was Jenny's, not loud, not advertised, but present in every small act. The blankets placed within reach before the night chill set in, the vases of fresh flowers on the table, the careful rationing of visitors when Delacroix's cough grew too violent. They had, without ever declaring it, made a pact. She would guard the conditions in which he could paint, and he would keep painting as long as his body allowed. In the spring of 1860, Delacroix suffered a severe throat infection that left his voice barely more than a whisper. The doctors prescribed rest, warm drinks, and the avoidance of damp air, advice Jenny enforced with quiet authority. She arranged his studio so he could work seated, moved his bed closer to the hearth, and, when he resisted her orders, stood her ground with the unshakable patience of someone who had spent decades navigating his stubborn streak. He complained, sometimes theatrically, about being managed like a fragile porcelain vase, but the truth was that he leaned on her more than ever. She was the one who spoke for him when visitors called, who read aloud his letters, who organized the studio's accounts and supplies. In every sense but the legal, she was his partner. Yet in the eyes of the world, she remained invisible. Her name appeared nowhere in official documents, no portrait of her hung in his rooms. No record of their conversations existed except for the scattered references in his journal. Delacroix's home, now a museum, was a modest two-story space built around a quiet courtyard. From his upstairs windows, he could see the bare branches of the plane trees reaching into the Parisian sky. Jenny kept the rooms warm and orderly, and on days when he felt strong enough, they would take short walks in the courtyard, her arms steadying him when his legs faltered. In those last years, their routines became rituals. Mornings began with coffee at his desk, Jenny reading aloud the day's news or letters. Afternoons were for painting, even if only for an hour. Evenings were quiet, a book, a brief conversation, sometimes silence broken only by the sound of brushes being washed in the sink. They had no need for grand declarations. The intimacy of their life together was in these patterns, in knowing exactly how the other took their tea, in anticipating a request before it was spoken, in the comfort of shared silence. In 1862, Delacroix began work on what would be among his last major paintings, Flowers in a Vase. It was an unusual choice for a man known for his great historical and literary subjects, but in its stillness, it carried a kind of distilled passion. Jenny prepared the flowers for him, selecting each stem from the market, arranging them so their forms played against each other in subtle harmonies. Friends later speculated that the painting was, in some way, a tribute to her, not a portrait in likeness, but in essence. The care, the arrangement, the quiet beauty held in a small space. These were Jenny's gifts, transposed into paint. By early August 1863, Delacroix's health was failing rapidly. His cough deepened, his appetite vanished, and even the act of sitting at his easel became exhausting. Jenny stayed at his side day and night, sleeping in a small chair in his room so she could wake if he needed anything. On the morning of August 13th, 1863, Delacroix asked her to open the shutters so the light could fall across the room. He looked at her for a long moment, an uncharacteristic pause from a man so often restless, and managed a faint smile. "You have been," he said in his hoarse whisper, "the good genius of my life." They were the last words he ever spoke to her. That afternoon, as the summer sun warmed the courtyard outside, Eugene Delacroix died. Jenny was the one who closed his eyes. His will, drawn up years earlier, left her a modest annuity enough to live on, though far from the wealth some might have expected for a woman who had given 40 years to his service and companionship. The art world offered her no public recognition. She was officially his faithful housekeeper, mentioned briefly in obituaries, if at all. Jenny lived quietly for another decade. Remaining in Paris, she guarded the few personal items she had kept from his studio, resisting offers from collectors who wanted relics of the great painter. When she died, sometime in the mid-1870s, she was buried in an unmarked grave. Her name faded from public memory, her role in Delacroix's life reduced to a footnote in biographies. And yet, without Jenny, much of Delacroix's work might never have been completed. She had been his anchor, his quiet support, the one who made it possible for him to focus entirely on his art, in a world that celebrated genius while overlooking the silent labor that sustained it. She was both essential and invisible. Her story asks us to consider how many great achievements are built on such unrecognized devotion. Not all love leaves behind portraits or poems. Sometimes it leaves only an ordered studio, a cup of tea placed at the right moment, a life arranged so that another's work can thrive. In the quiet rooms of the Musée Delacroix today, visitors walk through the spaces where they lived and worked, the studio, the small dining room, the view of the courtyard. They see his canvases, his brushes, his letters. They do not see Jenny, but if you stand in the stillness long enough, you can almost feel her presence, the faint sound of a chair being moved, the soft click of a teacup on porcelain, the shadow of a woman who kept the flame burning until the very last moment. Holyrood Palace, Edinburgh, February 1565. The air in the great hall was heavy with the scent of burning pine, mingling with the metallic tang of the freshly polished suits of armor lining the walls. Courtiers whispered in corners, eyes darting to the young man standing at the far end of the room, tall, golden-haired, with the easy grace of one born into nobility. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, had arrived in Scotland only weeks before, but already he had caused a stir. Mary, Queen of Scots, watched him from her dais, the candlelight catching the auburn in her hair. She was 22, in the full bloom of youth, and a queen twice over, by birthright of Scotland and with a claim to the English throne that made her a figure of fascination and fear across Europe. Widowed young after the death of Francis II of France, she had returned to rule a kingdom that was beautiful, fractious, and dangerous. When her eyes met Darnley's across the hall, the murmur of the court seemed to fade. He bowed with a flourish, the corners of his mouth lifting in a smile that was both respectful and assured. In that moment, Mary saw not just a courtier, but a man who carried himself as if he already belonged at her side. Darnley was no ordinary suitor. Tall and striking, he was also her cousin, sharing Tudor blood through Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII. This made him both an asset and a risk. By marrying him, Mary could strengthen her claim to the English crown, a move that would unsettle her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. Elizabeth, ever wary of rivals, had encouraged Darnley's visit to Scotland, thinking him a possible pawn to influence Mary's policies. But she had underestimated the young man's ambition and the spark between him and Mary. Within weeks, they were spending long hours together, hunting in the winter forests around Edinburgh, playing music in the candlelit chambers of Holyrood, speaking in the lilting blend of Scots and English that marked their shared heritage. Mary, an accomplished lute player, would sing in her soft contralto while Darnley accompanied her on the viol, their voices and instruments weaving in harmony. Mary had endured much in her young life: political exile, the loss of her mother, the suspicion of her English cousin, the grief of widowhood. In Darnley, she found not only political alignment, but a sense of vitality she had missed since her days in France. He was charming, witty, and attentive, with a courtly gallantry that flattered her as a woman, not just a monarch. Their walks in the gardens of Holyrood were moments of reprieve from the constant demands of state. She spoke to him of her dreams for a united Scotland and England, of her longing for stability in a realm torn by religious division. He listened intently, his hand brushing hers as they strolled past frost-tipped hedges. The contact was brief, but in the rigid etiquette of court life, it was electric. Not everyone welcomed the match. Mary's chief advisor, William Maitland of Lethington, warned her that Darnley was too young, too headstrong, and too fond of his own advancement. Protestant nobles feared his Catholic sympathies. Others resented the speed with which he had gained the Queen's favor. But Mary, accustomed to navigating male skepticism, held her course. She was no naive girl blindly in love. She was a ruler weighing the risks and rewards. Darnley's charm was one thing, but his lineage was a political weapon. A marriage between them would unite two strong claims to the English throne, sending a clear signal to Elizabeth and to the Catholic powers of Europe. Yet it would also ignite the envy and suspicion of the Scottish lords, many of whom already chafed under the rule of a young Catholic queen. In the midst of political wrangling, the personal bond between Mary and Darnley deepened. On stormy evenings, they would sit by the great hearth, a chessboard between them, the game often abandoned halfway as their conversation turned to poetry and philosophy. Mary, fluent in several languages, would recite verses in French. Darnley, in turn, would try and fail to match her fluency, making her laugh. Once, during a hawking expedition, a sudden squall forced them to take shelter in a small hunting lodge. There, without courtiers or guards, they shared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and wine. Darnley, ever the charmer, compared her beauty to the wild Scottish hills, impossible to tame, yet all the more worth the pursuit. It was a line she would remember. By April 1565, the court could no longer ignore the inevitability of their union. Mary announced her intention to marry Darnley, a declaration that sent shockwaves through Edinburgh. Elizabeth I, realizing too late the threat to her own position, demanded Darnley's return to England. Mary refused. In July, in the chapel of Holyrood Palace, they were wed in a Catholic ceremony. Mary wore a gown of white satin, embroidered with silver thread, her auburn hair crowned with pearls. Darnley, resplendent in cloth of gold, stood beside her with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. For the moment, however, it was a match celebrated in song and festivity. As they left the chapel, hand in hand, the bells of Edinburgh rang out over the city. In the eyes of the people, it was the union of beauty and strength, of love and political might. For Mary, it was the beginning of what she believed would be a partnership, one that could secure her throne and her happiness. But in the shadows of that celebration, seeds of discord had already been sown. Ambition, jealousy, and betrayal would soon creep into their marriage, testing both the crown and the heart that had chosen him. Would Mary's love survive the storm that was coming? Or would the man she had brought into her heart and her throne prove her undoing? Holyrood Palace, Autumn 1565. The glow of Mary and Darnley's summer wedding had begun to fade, replaced by the cold, shifting winds of Scottish politics. The lords who had bowed at their union now muttered in council chambers. Some had not forgiven Mary for marrying without their full consent. Others had grown uneasy with Darnley's conduct in the months since the vows were spoken. Darnley was only 19, and though handsome and charismatic, he lacked the discipline of a seasoned ruler. The courtly manners that had charmed Mary in their courtship were giving way to arrogance, a hunger for power that exceeded even what she had anticipated. He wanted not merely the title of king consort, but to be recognized as King of Scots in his own right, equal in authority to Mary, not merely her partner. Mary, who had been trained from girlhood in the intricate dance of monarchical power, understood the danger of granting such authority. The Scottish crown was fragile. To share it fully would weaken her own position and embolden her enemies. She tried to temper his ambition, speaking to him privately in the soft, deliberate tone she used when reasoning with the headstrong. But Darnley, flattered by sycophants and emboldened by his royal blood, grew restless under her refusal. Their private moments became rarer. Where once they had walked together in the palace gardens, they now dined apart, Darnley spending more time with young companions from the nobility, many of them known for their drinking, gambling, and late-night intrigues. He began disappearing from Holyrood for days at a time, returning with vague explanations and a careless kiss on her hand. Mary's counselors noticed. William Maitland approached her with veiled warnings, suggesting that Darnley's conduct might erode the stability of her rule. Mary, though wounded, defended her husband publicly. Privately, she began to feel the first stirrings of betrayal, not in the form of outright infidelity, but in the realization that the man she had chosen for both love and political partnership was pursuing his own course. By October, the political situation worsened. James Stuart, Earl of Moray, Mary's half-brother, led a group of Protestant lords in open rebellion, partly in opposition to Darnley's Catholic leanings and partly in resentment of his growing influence. Mary acted with her characteristic decisiveness, riding out at the head of her forces to confront the rebels. Darnley accompanied her, that his presence was more ceremonial than strategic. The rebellion fizzled, the lords fleeing into exile, but the victory brought Mary little joy. Rumors whispered through Edinburgh that Darnley had been privately negotiating with some of the rebels, even as he rode beside her. She did not confront him directly, not yet, but the seed of distrust had been planted deep. The tension between them seeped into their most intimate spaces. At night, they shared fewer words. When they did speak, the exchanges often ended in sharpness. Darnley accused her of keeping him in a subordinate role, of treating him as an ornament rather than a partner. Mary, her patience thinning, reminded him that she had married him as queen, not as a subject, but that the crown was not his to claim by right. At times, the old warmth would flicker back into life, an evening by the fire when he would play the viol as she sang, a shared laugh over a jest from one of her ladies-in-waiting. But those moments were fleeting, quickly swallowed by the undertow of suspicion and ambition. In the midst of the strain, Mary found comfort in the companionship of David Rizzio, an Italian musician who had risen in her household from court singer to private secretary. Rizzio was cultured, intelligent, and fiercely loyal to the Queen. He assisted her in correspondence with Catholic allies abroad, and often joined her in private. Musical evenings, occasions that became a small refuge from the fraying marriage. To Darnley, Rizzio's influence was intolerable. He saw the secretary not only as a rival for Mary's attention, but as a political threat. Rizzio's closeness to Mary fed the gossip mills of Edinburgh, and some whispered that their relationship was more than professional. Whether Darnley believed the rumors or merely found them convenient, he began to nurture a deadly resentment. By early 1566, Darnley's alliances had shifted. Seeking greater power, he began meeting with disaffected nobles, some of the same men who had opposed his marriage. Together, they plotted to remove Rizzio from influence, both as a personal enemy of Darnley and as a symbol of Mary's independence. Mary, now pregnant with her first child, sensed the undercurrents but underestimated their severity. She still hoped to repair her marriage, to bring Darnley back into the fold before the birth. She invited him to walk with her in the gardens again, to play music in the evenings, to sit beside her at council meetings. But each attempt was met with polite detachment or thinly veiled hostility. The final fracture came one cold March night in 1566. Mary was dining privately with a small circle of friends, Rizzio among them, when Darnley entered unexpectedly. He was pale, his expression unreadable, and at his side stood a group of armed men. In a sudden, violent act that would shock the kingdom, they dragged Rizzio from the room, stabbing him repeatedly before Mary's eyes. It was a murder not just of a man, but of trust. The message was unmistakable. Darnley had chosen to side with her enemies, to use violence to assert his will. Mary, terrified but unbroken, confronted her husband in the aftermath. Her words were measured, but her gaze was cold. She told him that whatever bond had existed between them as man and wife had been shattered. From that night, the marriage became a matter of necessity, not affection. The birth of their son, James, in June 1566, would bind them politically for a time, but the love that had once united them was gone, replaced by a dangerous mixture of resentment, political maneuvering, and a slow, inevitable march toward tragedy. Would the arrival of their heir heal the rift? Or would it only sharpen the knives waiting in the shadows of the Scottish court? Kirk O. Field, Edinburgh, February 9, 1567. The winter night was still, the moonlight pooling over the frozen cobblestones. From the modest lodging house of Kirk O. Field, a faint glow shone from the upper window where Lord Darnley lay abed. Illness had taken hold of him in recent weeks, a mysterious fever that left him pale, weakened, and restless. Mary had arranged for him to stay there, away from the damp drafts of Holyrood, hoping the fresh air and quiet would aid his recovery. She visited daily, sometimes twice, bringing food and speaking gently to him despite the widening gulf between them. They had not reconciled in any true sense. Rizzio's blood still stained the memory of their marriage, but the birth of their son, James, had created a fragile truce. To the public eye, Mary was fulfilling her duty as a wife. In truth, her visits were careful performances, a balancing act between protecting her reputation and managing a man who had become both a liability and a danger. The months since Rizzio's murder had been a labyrinth of shifting alliances. Darnley had grown paranoid, fearing retribution from those who despised him. He alternated between pledges of loyalty to Mary and whispered threats against her authority. His erratic behavior made him a pawn that no faction could fully control, and in the ruthless politics of 16th century Scotland, pawns were expendable. Mary's own counselors were split. Some urged her to sever ties with him formally through divorce or annulment, while others warned that such an act could imperil her son's legitimacy. Divorce would also risk scandal in Catholic Europe, weakening her position against Elizabeth of England. And so she endured, visiting him at Kirklefield, keeping up appearances, while behind the scenes, rumors of plots began to coil through the court. In early February, Mary attended the wedding festivities of one of her household members, the Earl of Bothwell, a man whose loyalty to her was both admired and distrusted in equal measure. Darnley, still too ill to attend, sent word asking her to come to him after the celebrations. She agreed, but only for a brief evening visit. When she arrived at Kirklefield that night, the air inside was heavy with the scent of sickness and damp wool. Darnley lay in bed, his once proud posture diminished. Yet his eyes still carried the same piercing blue she had first noticed across the hall at Holyrood 2 years earlier. For a moment, she remembered the man who had once made her laugh in the gardens, who had played the viol while she sang. They spoke quietly about their son, about his health. He reached for her hand, and though she let him take it, the gesture felt like a memory rather than a renewal. She promised to visit again the next day before returning to the palace. In the early hours before dawn, Edinburgh was shaken by a violent explosion. The lodging house at Kirklefield was engulfed in fire, its timbers splintering into the night sky. Townspeople rushed toward the blaze, but by the time they arrived, the building was a smoldering ruin. Strangely, Darnley's body was found not inside the wreckage, but in a nearby orchard, along with that of a servant. Neither bore injuries consistent with the blast. They had been strangled. The details were chilling, and the implications immediate. This was no accident. Someone had planned the destruction with precision, ensuring Darnley would not leave the night alive. Suspicion erupted in every direction. Some pointed fingers at the rebel lords who had once allied with Darnley, claiming they feared his return to power. Others accused the Earl of Bothwell, whose closeness to Mary was already fodder for gossip. A darker whisper suggested that Mary herself had consented to the deed, a queen desperate to be rid of a dangerous and untrustworthy husband. Mary's grief was public but measured. She attended the funeral in solemn black, her face composed, her voice steady. Yet the perception of her changed overnight. Where once she had been the young, romantic queen marrying for love, she was now painted as a calculating figure in the continental rumor mills, a woman whose marriage had ended in fire and murder. For those who had witnessed the early days of Mary and Darnley's courtship, the contrast was stark. What began as a union of beauty, youth, and political promise had unraveled into mutual distrust, betrayal, and death. The very qualities that had once drawn them together, ambition, pride, and the allure of shared power, had become the fault lines that destroyed them. And yet, their brief love had left an enduring mark on history. Through their son, James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, the crowns of Scotland and England would one day unite, fulfilling, in a way, the vision Mary had once shared with Darnley in the gardens of Holyrood. The tragedy of Mary and Darnley is not simply that their marriage failed, but that it was born into a world where love and politics could not be disentangled. They were not free to be merely husband and wife. They were monarch and consort, heirs to intertwined crowns, players in a game where affection was currency and trust was as fragile as glass. In the quiet moments before his betrayal, there may have been genuine love, or at least the spark of it. But once the machinery of ambition began to grind, neither could escape its pull. Mary would go on to marry again, to face imprisonment and eventual execution, her name forever entangled with the question of whether she had loved Darnley enough to spare him, or hated him enough to see him gone. Darnley would be remembered less for the man he was than for the manner of his death, his life's final chapter written in fire and shadow. In the end, their story leaves us with a question that echoes through centuries. When love is forged in the crucible of power, can it ever survive its heat? Or is it doomed, like theirs, to burn brightly for a moment and then consume itself entirely? 2 centuries later, their names rest side by side in the national pantheon, not as lovers alone, but as architects of a revolution. Yet, while Bolivar's face is cast in statues, Manuela's courage still whispers from the shadows of history. If you believe her story deserves to be remembered as loudly as his, share this video and let her name travel farther than the exile that once tried to silence her.